I still remember the first time I felt completely invisible, as if the world had quietly decided I did not matter. It was a sensation that crept into my bones, subtle at first, like a shadow slipping over sunlit ground. I was 13, the age when life should have been simple, innocent, and filled with laughter. Yet my days had already begun to feel heavy, as if each step carried a secret weight that no one could see. Even then, I knew something fundamental had shifted in my world, though I could not yet name it. There were moments when I longed to speak, to cry out for help, but an invisible barrier kept me silent, a barrier forged from fear, confusion, and the subtle manipulation of those I had been taught to trust. I had learned early that safety was fragile, a fragile illusion. The people who should have protected me had quietly chosen themselves over me, and I carried that realization like a stone in my chest. Each morning I would rise, wash my hands, and fold my habits neatly, pretending the world outside the convent walls did not exist, pretending I was unaffected by the tension that vibrated in every corner of my home. My friends noticed my quietness, whispered about my withdrawn demeanor, but I could not tell them anything, not yet. They would not understand, and I had learned that even those closest to me could turn away in disbelief. It was not until I had been accepted into the convent school that I truly met her, Margaret Sinclair. I did not know her name at first, for introductions in those early days were formal and distant. She was older, a figure both stern and kind, with eyes that seemed to see more than she spoke. The first time she approached me, it was during recreation, when the other girls laughed and exchanged stories that felt foreign to me. She simply asked, "Are you well?" Her tone was gentle, a quiet inquiry that carried no judgment. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. My voice caught. The words lodged in my throat as they always did, but she did not push. She waited silently, as if she understood that some things could not be rushed. Some confessions could not be forced. It was days later, after I had learned the rhythm of the convent, the silent prayers at dawn, the long hours of study, the soft hum of chants in the chapel, that Margaret Sinclair finally became a name I associated with safety. She had noticed the tremor in my hands when I carried books, the way I avoided the gaze of my peers, the way my laughter never reached my eyes. She never asked about my past directly, only offered small gestures of kindness, a book left on my desk, a reassuring smile when she passed in the hall, a quiet nod during meals. It was in these tiny acknowledgments that I first sensed the possibility of trust, the faintest flicker of hope that someone could see me as more than a shadow. But the memories were never far behind. I remembered the stifling heat of my home that March in the year 1965, the sense of dread that had filled the kitchen when I realized my mother, who should have been my protector, had chosen silence over intervention. I remembered the fear that had made my legs tremble and my hands shake, the crushing weight of knowing that those who were meant to love me would not defend me. I had learned to hide my tears in the folds of my sleeves, to smile in ways that deceived everyone, to carry on as if the horrors were mere stories I had overheard rather than a life I had endured. Even within the quiet confines of the convent, I could not escape the echoes of that betrayal. At night, lying in the narrow bed, I would awaken to dreams that were too vivid, too real, as if the past had found a way to haunt me even here. I would clutch the sheets, whispering prayers that sounded hollow even to my own ears, wishing for a protection I did not yet believe was possible. It was in these moments of fear that I began to understand the resilience I would need to survive, the inner fortitude that Margaret Sinclair would nurture without ever demanding my secrets. One evening, after a day filled with lessons and chores, she approached me again, holding a small volume of prayers bound in worn leather. "For when the nights feel too long," she said softly, placing it gently on my desk. I looked at her, hesitant, and she smiled. Not the indulgent smile of someone amused, but the kind smile of someone who had seen suffering and did not flinch. I nodded once, a small gesture, but it was enough. I opened the book later that night, tracing the words with trembling fingers, repeating each phrase silently, grounding myself in each line. For the first time in months, I felt a measure of calm. That calm was fragile. easily broken by the memories that threatened to spill over the walls I had built around myself. Yet it was a beginning. Margaret Sinclair had shown me that it was possible to be seen without being judged, to be cared for without expectation, and to take the first, tentative steps toward a life I could someday claim as my own. Even then, I did not fully understand how much courage it would require, nor how long the journey ahead would be. But I knew one thing with clarity: I would not allow my past to define me forever. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered a silent prayer for strength, hoping the morning would bring a day where fear did not rule my every thought. Long before the shadows of betrayal had fully descended upon my life, there was a fragile innocence that clung to me like morning mist. I was born into a house that smelled of candles and old books, where laughter and quiet songs intertwined with the clatter of dishes and the distant hum of church bells. My mother, a woman of meticulous order and soft voice, carried herself with grace, yet I sensed in her eyes the weight of compromises made for the sake of survival. My father, or rather, the man who held sway over our household, was a figure both imposing and unpredictable, his temper as sudden as the summer storms in our small town. From an early age, I learned that harmony could be fragile, that a single word or glance could tip the delicate balance of my home. I was 12 when I first realized that appearances could be deceiving. The neighbors would smile and nod at my mother as she walked to the market or returned from morning errands, praising her composure, her care for the household, her dutiful attention to the children. Yet behind the closed doors, the house often trembled with tensions no one could see, a tension that I, in my small frame, could feel in every step I took. I learned to navigate it with careful precision, folding my movements into silence, keeping my voice low, and avoiding the sharp gaze of my father. I became observant, reading the subtle cues in tone and gesture, learning to anticipate moods, and shaping my behavior to avoid their eruption. Even then, I believed my mother would protect me. She was the one I turned to when I fell, scraped my knees, or felt the sting of childish humiliation. She would brush my hair, whisper encouragement, and soothe my tears. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when I glimpsed a different truth. Her eyes would flick toward him, the corners of her mouth tight with unspoken fear, and I understood that in those moments my safety depended not on her courage, but on her calculation. That understanding weighed heavily on me, though I could not yet name it as betrayal. It was a seed planted in the soil of my trust, one that would grow in darkness in the years to come. School offered a brief reprieve from the tension at home, though it was never complete. My teachers were kind, yet I could sense that they measured me against a standard I could not reach. Not because I lacked ability, but because my mind was burdened with vigilance. I watched my peers laugh freely, their voices carrying across the playground, and I envied them the freedom I could not claim. When asked to read aloud, I would stumble, my voice shaking, and when they encouraged me, I would smile faintly, masking the turmoil that churned within. Every day was a careful negotiation, a silent pact with myself to remain invisible, to survive without drawing attention. At home, I began to retreat inwardly, creating secret spaces in my mind where the chaos of the house could not reach me. I spent hours in the small attic under the sloped roof, arranging my sketches of gardens and fields, imagining worlds where I could run without fear. The sun slanted through the dusty windows in golden shafts, and in those beams I felt a momentary peace, as if the universe itself had carved a small refuge for me. In the evenings I would kneel by my bedside, reciting prayers I barely understood, feeling the weight of my own fragility pressed against my chest. The world was vast, and yet I existed in its tiniest corners, unnoticed and cautious. I remember one winter evening when the first snow fell thick and silent across the cobblestones of our town. I had just returned from the convent preparatory classes, carrying books that smelled of parchment and ink. My mother was in the kitchen tending to a pot of stew, the warm aroma mingling with the crisp scent of snow through the half-open window. I paused in the doorway, longing to speak, to tell her of the fear that had lodged itself in my chest that day, but the words died before they left my lips. She smiled faintly, her attention on the pot, and I knew it was not the right moment, or perhaps that it would never be the right moment. I retreated silently to my room, where the small lamp cast shadows across the walls, and I traced the outlines of my future in the margins of my notebooks. It was during these years that I first discovered the duality of trust and fear. My mother, for all her gentleness, had begun to show that her loyalty was divided, that her protection had limits dictated not by love alone, but by the necessity of preserving her own place in a household ruled by control and subtle terror. I could not yet articulate it, but I understood it instinctively. To survive, I must learn not to rely entirely on her, must build my own fortress of vigilance within. Each day I constructed it more firmly, layering caution and restraint over the natural openness of childhood. I spent the nights pondering the injustice of it, kneeling at the edge of my bed, repeating prayers for courage I was only beginning to recognize I would need. The gentle chants of the convent choir would echo in my mind, though I was not yet there. Even then I understood that some doors, once closed, could only be opened from within, and that I would need to find the strength to open them myself. It was in the quiet corners of these early years that I began to cultivate resilience, a slow, painstaking growth that would sustain me when the shadows finally fell in earnest. I learned to find moments of stillness, to observe without being observed, to hope without being seen. And even in that fragile hope, I imagined a figure who might one day guide me, someone who would see me fully, not just the part I had learned to hide. Little did I know that when I arrived at the convent, I would meet exactly that person, Margaret Sinclair, a presence as quiet as a prayer, yet as steadfast as the walls of the sanctuary itself. And in that meeting, the first threads of trust began to weave through the fabric of my fear, a delicate tapestry that would carry me forward, step by step, into a world that was both frightening and full of possibility. The first time I truly understood that the walls around me could not keep me safe was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it cut deeper than any visible wound. I had learned to navigate the world with careful observation, to anticipate the moods of those around me, to measure my words and gestures with precision. Yet there came a day, still vivid in my memory, when the illusion of protection was shattered. It was not a sudden violence, nor a loud confrontation, but a quiet moment, a subtle shift in tone and glance that spoke volumes. I was 14, the age when curiosity and trust should bloom freely. Yet every instinct told me to retreat, to shrink, to fold into myself. My mother, who had always seemed the anchor of our household, now appeared increasingly distant. Her eyes, once warm and attentive, often flickered with unease whenever he, my stepfather, entered the room. The small exchanges I had once taken for guidance or concern had become tainted with hesitation, as though she measured her words carefully, balancing truth with what she hoped to protect. It was during one of these days, a damp afternoon in 1966, that I first realized the depth of her compromise. I had sought her advice, a simple question about my lessons at school, hoping for a moment of connection, yet her response was brief, almost evasive. "Do as you are told, my child," she said, her tone clipped, her gaze darting away. Something in that moment told me she was weighing the safety of another above my own. The sense of betrayal began to take root slowly, a quiet erosion of trust. My stepfather's presence was oppressive, though not always overtly threatening. He would comment on my appearance or the way I moved, subtle words that lingered in my mind, creating unease I could not yet name. I would look to my mother for reassurance, for protection, and she would smile faintly, nodding but never intervening. It was as if a silent understanding passed between them, one that left me out entirely. The weight of that realization was nearly unbearable. I had learned to hide my fear behind a composed face, to carry on with my studies, to perform chores and prayers with the outward appearance of calm. Yet inside a tempest raged. School offered little relief. My teachers noticed the change, commented on my withdrawn nature, and tried to coax me into engagement. I complied outwardly, but my mind wandered, haunted by the tension at home. I could not articulate the fear I felt, the gnawing knowledge that my mother, the one person I thought would always protect me, had begun to side with his control. I practiced my lessons mechanically, wrote my assignments carefully. Yet the fear seeped into every page, every word, every pause. Friendships became distant. I did not trust my own voice to convey the truth. The first true test of my resilience came during an ordinary evening, when a small misstep, a book left on the edge of the table, was met with a sharp comment from my stepfather. I recoiled instinctively, knowing that any outward sign of protest or explanation would draw disapproval, perhaps even punishment. My mother, who stood nearby, watched quietly, offering no defense, no correction. Her silence screamed louder than any words could have. I understood, in that moment, that she had chosen the path of peace over the path of protection. My own advocate had become an observer, a silent witness, leaving me to navigate the storm alone. I began to withdraw further, not in rebellion, but in self-preservation. My steps became measured, my voice soft, my presence muted. I avoided eye contact, spoke only when required, and learned to predict the ebb and flow of moods in our household. I built secret spaces within my mind where no one could reach me, imaginary rooms where I could rest without fear. Yet the intrusion of reality never ceased. Every glance from him, every unspoken look from my mother, reminded me that my safety was conditional, contingent on her willingness to placate rather than protect. At night, I would kneel at the edge of my bed, praying with whispered words that felt inadequate even to myself. I asked for guidance, for courage, for protection, though I had already begun to understand that the answers would not come externally. My sanctuary became internal, the cultivation of inner strength a necessity for survival. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of impending conflict, the shifts in posture, the tension in a hand, the glance that preceded criticism. These lessons were cruel but essential. They taught me vigilance, patience, and the unspoken art of self-preservation. It was during these years that I first realized the insidious power of betrayal when it came from someone who loved you. My mother's choices, made perhaps to protect herself or to maintain a fragile peace, left me vulnerable to fear and manipulation. Her quiet compliance allowed the oppressive presence in our home to exert its influence unchecked. And yet, I did not hate her. The love I felt for her was complicated by fear and disappointment. I recognized her humanity even as I recognized my own isolation. The first true encounter with Margaret Sinclair, when it came later, seemed almost preordained in contrast. She offered a presence that was consistent, compassionate, and entirely my own. She did not judge, did not pry, and did not demand. She allowed me to exist within her observation, to be seen without fear, to be nurtured without expectation. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible intervention, yet it became a lifeline. The small gestures, a smile, a book, a nod, were the first threads of connection I could trust. In her presence, the world outside, with its betrayals and compromises, felt distant, almost manageable. Even as the first betrayals had settled into my consciousness, I began to understand that survival required more than hiding or compliance. It required the slow, deliberate cultivation of inner resilience. The lessons of observation, vigilance, and measured response were the tools I would carry forward, long before I could name the betrayal, long before I could fully trust in the sanctuary offered by Margaret Sinclair. In the quiet hours before sleep, I would trace these lessons over and over, acknowledging the pain without surrendering to it. The shadows of betrayal lingered, but with each passing day, a glimmer of hope began to grow, a hope that perhaps one day I would not simply survive, but live. And it was that fragile hope, nurtured in the presence of quiet kindness, that would sustain me as the more severe trials approached, and the real tests of courage and faith lay ahead. By the time I had reached my 15th year, I understood that the walls I had built around myself were both protection and prison. I moved through the world quietly, carefully, measuring every step, every word, every glance. The safety I sought was never guaranteed, not at home, not among my peers, and not even in the spaces I had once believed were neutral. The fear I carried had become a constant companion, a shadow that whispered warnings in every silent corner of my existence. I learned to mask it, to fold it beneath layers of obedience and composure, but it remained, persistent and unyielding. At home, the tension was nearly palpable. My mother's presence, once a source of comfort, had become a reminder of compromise, of the cost of survival in a household dominated by his authority. I would approach her with questions, small inquiries about lessons or chores, hoping for reassurance or guidance, only to receive a clipped word, a brief nod, or silence. Each time, the subtle betrayal stung more sharply than any overt punishment, for it confirmed the unspoken truth. She had chosen to preserve herself and the fragile appearance of harmony over my safety. My attempts to confide in her were met with deflection, a gentle insistence that I not trouble the household or question the authority that governed it. At school, I began to withdraw further. Teachers noted my quietness, my hesitancy, and encouraged participation, but the effort required to mask the turmoil within me made engagement exhausting. I would sit through lessons, feigning attention, while my mind replayed small incidents at home, her glance that betrayed a secret alliance, the sharp tone of his words, the subtle gestures of control that I had learned to recognize. I learned to internalize everything, to carry the weight of fear alone, and to present a calm exterior that hid the storm within. Even friends could not pierce the veil of my silence. I wanted to reach out, to share the burden that had lodged itself in my chest, but the memory of my mother's compromise warned me against it. Who could I trust, when even the one person who should have protected me had failed? I smiled politely when asked questions, laughed softly at jokes, but my heart was elsewhere, navigating the labyrinth of fear I had constructed for survival. Every night, as I lay in the narrow bed of my bedroom, I replayed the day in meticulous detail, noting every misstep, every hint of disapproval, every moment that had required restraint. It was exhausting work, yet necessary. I had learned that my safety depended on vigilance and discretion. During this period, I began to understand the insidious power of silence. Words unspoken, confessions withheld, feelings unshared, they became chains around my spirit, binding me to fear, shaping my sense of self, and dictating my responses to the world. I practiced restraint, not out of obedience, but out of survival, learning to anticipate consequences before they arrived. A frown, a sharp tone, a glance. These were enough to remind me that speaking out could lead to exposure, punishment, or disappointment. My silence became both shield and shackle, protecting me from immediate harm, but imprisoning me in a world of solitude and unacknowledged suffering. The nights were the worst. I would kneel by my bedside, whispering prayers that sometimes felt hollow, sometimes felt like fragile threads holding me to hope. I imagined worlds where I could speak freely, where my fears were acknowledged, where my voice mattered. Yet when I awoke in the mornings, the reality of my home pressed down again, reminding me that such freedoms were not mine to claim. I folded my habits carefully, prepared for the day, and moved through each task with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the fragile illusion of stability could shatter. It was during these years that Margaret Sinclair's subtle interventions became crucial. I noticed her presence more keenly, her eyes attentive to the small signs of my distress. She never asked about the details of my home life, never pressed for explanations I was not ready to give. Instead, she offered small gestures, an encouraging smile, a book left discreetly on my desk, a nod of acknowledgement in passing. These tiny acts created a space where I could breathe, a pocket of safety that I could inhabit without fear of judgment or reprisal. In that space, I began to understand that silence, though imprisoning, could be navigated with support, and that trust could exist even amidst fear. Despite the quiet sanctuary of the convent, the burden of secrecy remained heavy. I had learned to carry it in layers, compartmentalizing fear, disappointment, and longing for protection. Even when I whispered prayers, I often spoke more to maintain a semblance of hope than out of faith. The act itself was a ritual of survival, a way to anchor myself amidst the chaos that I could not escape. I began to recognize the importance of resilience, not merely as a concept, but as a daily practice, one that demanded vigilance, patience, and unwavering attention to the world around me. By the time I reached the midpoint of my 15th year, I had become adept at navigating this delicate balance between fear and survival. The walls of my home, once a place of warmth, had become a classroom for caution and restraint. I understood the cost of speaking, the fragility of trust, and the quiet power of observation. And yet, even in the midst of this isolation, a faint ember of hope persisted, a hope that someone, perhaps Margaret Sinclair herself, could offer a steady presence, a lifeline, a model of unwavering support that did not depend on compromise or fear. This realization did not make the burden lighter, but it provided direction. I began to focus on what I could control, my movements, my reactions, my thoughts. I learned to recognize the subtle cues of danger, the indicators of control, and the patterns of manipulation that had been woven into my early life. The silence that had once imprisoned me began to transform, slowly, into a tool, a means of observing and preparing, a way to navigate the treacherous terrain of my home without succumbing entirely to despair. And in the quiet moments, when the convent was still and the world outside had gone to rest, I would hold on to the memory of those small gestures, the book on my desk, the nod of acknowledgement, the reassuring smile. They were fragile, fleeting, and yet they offered a vision of what life could be when one could trust, even cautiously, in another. And it was in those moments, as I whispered my prayers and traced the lines of my inner sanctuary, that I understood something vital: the silence, though heavy, could be endured, and the future, though uncertain, could be shaped by the choices I made in the present. The moment came quietly, yet it hit with the force of everything I had been holding inside for years. I was 16, the age when one expects a semblance of control over their own life, yet I had none. Each day had been a careful negotiation of fear and obedience, every movement calculated, every word measured. And yet, there was no preparation for the crushing weight that bore down on me that winter in the year 1967, a weight born not of sudden violence, but of accumulated betrayal. It pressed into my chest, tightening with every heartbeat, and I realized I could no longer contain the turmoil within. It began in the ordinary confines of our home. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, when a small mistake, a dropped book, a misaligned chair, sparked his ire. His voice, low but sharp, sliced through the air, carrying criticism that was both public and intimate. My body stiffened, my hands shook, and for a fleeting moment, I had to remind myself to breathe. I looked to my mother, expecting intervention, a shield, a small act of protection. But her eyes were fixed elsewhere, focused on mundane tasks, indifferent to the tempest. I understood then, fully, that she had chosen him over me, again, as she had in so many unspoken moments before. That day, the walls I had built around my spirit began to crack. The years of careful silence, the constant vigilance, the relentless calculation of every word and gesture, all of it felt suddenly insufficient. My fear, which had been a tool of survival, transformed into a prison with no doors, no windows, no way to escape. I felt the helplessness settle in, thick and suffocating, as I realized that those who should have protected me had consistently failed. Even the small moments of perceived kindness from my mother now felt tainted by compromise. A reminder that loyalty had limits, and mine had been stretched beyond endurance. I retreated to my room, seeking refuge in the familiar confines of narrow walls and a small lamp, the shadows dancing across the ceiling like memories I could not escape. My hands trembled as I traced the edges of my notebooks, pages filled with sketches and thoughts, the only outlets I had permitted myself. Tears threatened, yet I refused them, knowing that any display of weakness could be met with ridicule or further disregard. The silence of the house outside mirrored the silence within me, both oppressive, both inescapable. I felt as though I were a prisoner of my own mind, the culmination of years of subtle betrayals converging into a single, unbearable weight. It was during this period of suffocating despair that Margaret Sinclair's presence became an anchor, however slight. She had always been observant, her eyes noticing what I could not articulate, her gestures gentle but deliberate. She did not ask for explanations, did not demand confessions I was not ready to give. Instead, she provided moments of reprieve, an encouraging word in the hallway, a small book left for me on the desk, a subtle nod during prayers. These acts were quiet lifelines, though fragile, yet they offered a glimpse of safety and consistency in a life otherwise dominated by fear and betrayal. Despite these small gestures, the breaking point was inevitable. I found myself confronting the full weight of my reality. The home I had once seen as sanctuary was a stage for manipulation and control. The people who should have nurtured and defended me had failed, and the fear I had carried silently for years was now uncontainable. In the privacy of my room, I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotions I had suppressed: grief, anger, disbelief, and sorrow. It was a catharsis long overdue, a moment of emotional release that left me exhausted yet strangely awakened. In that fragile state, I realized that survival required more than endurance. It required action, a recognition that I could not rely solely on others for protection. The first steps toward resilience were born in that moment of despair. I began to understand that strength was not merely the absence of fear, but the ability to navigate it, to survive it, and eventually, to transcend it. Each breath became an assertion of my existence, each heartbeat a quiet protest against the injustice I had endured. The breaking point also brought clarity. I saw the patterns that had governed my life, the subtle manipulation, the selective protection, the compromises made by those I trusted. And I understood that while the past could not be changed, the future remained mine to shape. I began to plan cautiously and deliberately for ways to protect myself, to assert my voice in spaces where it had previously been stifled, and to cultivate allies who could provide the support I had long been denied. It was during one of these evenings, in the quiet of my dimly lit room, that I first contemplated the possibility of escape, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of reclaiming autonomy over my own life. The journey would be long, fraught with emotional and spiritual challenges, yet the breaking point had made one thing clear. I could no longer remain passive, could no longer let fear dictate my every action. The first steps toward reclaiming my agency had begun, and I felt, for the first time in years, a cautious glimmer of hope. Even in the midst of despair, I held on to the small kindnesses Margaret Sinclair had offered. They were reminders that not all authority was cruel, that not all adults were complicit in the suppression of my voice. In her quiet observance, in the careful attention she gave without demand or judgment, I found a model of integrity and support that I could aspire to, and perhaps, one day, emulate. The breaking point was not merely an end, it was a beginning, the crucible in which resilience would be forged. The moment when I first understood that survival depended not only on enduring betrayal, but on recognizing the possibility of sanctuary, however tenuous. And so, in the cold winter of 1967, amidst the weight of silence and the echoes of betrayal, I began to prepare, not for vengeance, not for confrontation, but for the slow, deliberate reclamation of my life, my voice, and my spirit. The breaking point had arrived, but it did not break me entirely. It became the foundation upon which the next phase of my journey would be built, one careful step at a time, toward healing, understanding, and ultimately, hope. The revelation arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it struck with a clarity I had not expected. I was 16, approaching the end of that year marked by fear, restraint, and silence, when the full weight of truth finally became undeniable. The small fractures I had noticed in my mother's attentiveness, the subtle gestures of compromise, had grown into a reality I could no longer ignore. It was not a dramatic confrontation, nor a loud confession shouted across the kitchen, but rather a series of moments, each confirming what I had long suspected: that my mother had chosen the preservation of her marriage and the household's image over the protection of her own child. It began with an ordinary morning, the first frost of 1968 coating the streets outside in white, delicate, and deceptive. I had returned from school, the cold air stinging my cheeks, the lessons of the day heavy on my mind. My mother was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the meticulous care she always exhibited, yet her movements were distant, almost mechanical. My stepfather sat at the table, reading the newspaper, his presence oppressive despite its quietude. I approached cautiously, carrying a small stack of notes I had prepared for my upcoming lessons, seeking a word of encouragement or acknowledgement. Her glance met mine briefly, then drifted away. The unspoken understanding hung in the air. Tangible and suffocating, she would not intervene, would not defend me. Later that afternoon, a minor accident provided the moment of clarity I could no longer deny. I had been tasked with carrying a pot of water from the kitchen to the small basin in the laundry room, a chore I had performed countless times. My foot slipped on the slick floor, and the water spilled, drenching my feet and the hem of my dress. My stepfather's voice, sharp and accusing, filled the hallway. I flinched instinctively, expecting a rebuke or worse. My mother appeared moments later, not with comfort, not with protection, but with a quiet admonition to be careful, her eyes flicking briefly toward him before returning to the task at hand. The message was unmistakable. The priority was the preservation of appearances, not my safety. The true revelation, however, came that evening when a neighbor, one we rarely saw, arrived at our door. She had noticed bruises on my arms, faint but visible beneath the folds of my sleeves. She questioned my mother gently, asking if I had fallen or been hurt. My mother's response was careful, measured, and devastating in its omission. She offered an explanation that concealed the truth entirely, protecting her husband, preserving the household's image, and leaving me exposed. The knowledge settled in my chest like a stone. I had been betrayed, not by strangers, not by fate, but by the very person who should have been my shield. I retreated to the solitude of my bedroom. A small room with walls painted a pale, muted blue, the paint chipped at the corners from years of wear. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, tracing the seams of the quilt with trembling fingers, and let myself feel the full weight of the realization. The tears I had long suppressed came freely, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to sob without restraint. The betrayal was complete, yet it was a moment of awakening. I understood that the silence that had dominated my life, the secrecy I had maintained, and the fear that had governed my movements had all been shaped by her choices. In the quiet of that evening, I began to contemplate the implications of this revelation. My mother had made her decision, prioritizing the safety of her marriage and the stability of the household over the welfare of her child. This knowledge could have broken me, yet it did not. The pain was profound, the sense of isolation almost unbearable, but within it, a seed of determination began to take root. I realized that I could no longer rely on her for protection, and I would need to cultivate my own strength, my own means of survival. The revelation, though painful, marked a turning point. I understood with clarity the necessity of self-reliance, of vigilance, and of discerning trust. Margaret Sinclair's influence, though subtle, provided a counterpoint to this revelation. Her consistent presence, her gentle attentiveness, and her refusal to demand explanations created a safe space in which I could begin to process the betrayal. I began to recognize that not all adults were complicit in the suppression of my voice, and that it was possible to find guidance and protection outside the confines of my family. Margaret's quiet observation, her careful gestures of support, became a model for the kind of strength I could aspire to cultivate. The nights following the revelation were filled with contemplation and prayer. I knelt beside my bed, whispering words that were both supplications and affirmations, acknowledging the betrayal while asserting my determination to endure. The silence of the house outside was a stark reminder of the reality I faced. Yet within me, a clarity emerged. I would survive, I would endure, and I would find a path forward that was my own. The betrayal could not erase my existence, nor could it dictate the terms of my future. In those quiet hours, I began to map the steps I would need to take, each one small but deliberate, maintaining vigilance, cultivating inner resilience, and seeking out the guidance of those whose intentions were pure. The revelation had stripped away illusions, leaving a raw and painful truth, yet it also illuminated the path toward autonomy, self-preservation, and eventual healing. I understood that trust would have to be earned, carefully and deliberately, and that the lessons learned from this betrayal would shape the choices I made in the years to come. By the end of that long evening, the initial shock of betrayal had softened into a focused resolve. I understood that my mother's choices, while profoundly hurtful, did not have to define me. The revelation was not an end, but a beginning, a painful, necessary awakening that would guide me through the challenges ahead. I began to see that within the depths of despair, there existed the potential for strength, for clarity, and for the slow reclamation of a life that was, ultimately my own. And in the quiet of my room, with the winter wind whispering against the shutters, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The revelation had come, painful and unavoidable, yet it had also provided a compass, a way to navigate the complex terrain of trust, betrayal, and survival that lay ahead. I knew then that the journey would be long and arduous, but I also knew, with a certainty that had eluded me for years, that I would not be broken entirely. The first steps toward reclaiming my voice, my agency, and my spirit had begun. The days following the revelation of my mother's betrayal were heavy with uncertainty. I was 16, teetering on the edge of adolescence and early womanhood, and yet I felt the weight of a life far older than my years. The knowledge that the person meant to protect me had failed left me not only isolated, but questioning the very foundations upon which I had built my understanding of the world. I began to see shadows in every gesture, hear hesitation in every tone, and feel the fragility of trust as a constant pressure against my chest. My home, once a place of familiar routines and muted safety, now felt like a labyrinth of hidden dangers and half-truths. In school, I moved like a ghost among my peers. Teachers noticed my withdrawn demeanor and encouraged participation, but the effort required to mask the turmoil within me left me exhausted. I smiled when prompted, nodded when addressed, yet my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past months. Each whispered conversation in the hallway, each glance from a classmate seemed amplified through a lens of suspicion and fear. I had become vigilant to the point of paranoia, instinctively guarding every thought and word from those who might exploit my vulnerabilities. The betrayal at home had fractured more than my sense of security. It had shaken my faith in others and, to some degree, in myself. Faith, once a source of comfort, began to feel tenuous. I questioned not only the adults around me, but the presence of any higher power that might intervene on my behalf. Prayers, once soothing, now felt hollow, my whispered words bouncing back at me from the silent walls of my room. Yet even in doubt I clung to ritual. Kneeling at the edge of my bed each night, I recited the prayers I had learned as a child, tracing each word carefully, repeating them until they became a rhythm, a heartbeat in the darkness. I did not know whether the prayers were heard, or if they even mattered, but the act itself was a lifeline, a reminder that I could claim a fragment of control, however small, in a world that had left me unprotected. The fractured faith extended to my mother as well. Her choices weighed heavily on me, the silent complicity, the prioritization of her husband's reputation over my safety, a wound that refused to close. I did not hate her entirely. That would have been too simple, too human. Instead, I felt a complex tangle of sorrow, disappointment, and cautious understanding. I realized she had made the choices she thought necessary to survive in a household governed by fear, yet the consequences had fallen upon me, shaping my perception of trust, loyalty, and protection in ways that would endure for years. Amid this turmoil, Margaret Sinclair remained a quiet presence, a beacon of consistency in the uncertainty that had become my life. She did not offer platitudes or easy solutions. She did not insist upon confessions I was not ready to give. Instead, she provided small, tangible reassurances, an encouraging nod during prayer, a book placed carefully on my desk, a smile that conveyed understanding without judgment. These gestures, though subtle, became the scaffolding upon which I could begin to reconstruct a sense of faith, not in the reliability of adults universally, but in the possibility that some people, some forces, could offer genuine care and guidance. Yet even her presence could not fully shield me from the internal dissonance that plagued my days. I wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. Why had my mother not acted? Could I ever trust anyone again? Was it possible to find guidance without relying on those who had already failed me? I walked through classrooms, corridors, and convent halls with the careful awareness of one who expects betrayal at any corner, balancing the need for connection with the instinct to protect myself. Every smile, every gesture was weighed and measured, filtered through the lens of experience and survival. During this time, I began to understand the duality of resilience and vulnerability. I was capable of strength beyond my years, navigating the intricacies of a household and a world that had repeatedly shown me its capacity for disappointment. Yet beneath that exterior I was fragile, wounded by the betrayal of someone I had once relied upon implicitly. My faith, fractured as it was, required delicate tending, a cultivation of hope amidst evidence to the contrary. I began to see that survival demanded both courage and careful discernment, a recognition that trust could not be freely given but must be earned, nurtured and tested. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons of the past years, the early betrayals, the subtle manipulations, the silent witness of my mother. I recognized that my survival depended upon vigilance, self-reliance, and the cultivation of a careful, deliberate inner life. The external world might offer only limited safety, but the internal world, my mind, my conscience, my capacity for reflection, was mine to shape, mine to protect. In this private sanctuary, I began to plan, cautiously, for a future in which I might reclaim a measure of autonomy, voice, and dignity. Margaret Sinclair's quiet interventions provided both a model and a lifeline. She demonstrated that care could exist without compromise, that guidance could be offered without judgment, and that trust, when carefully extended, could be a source of stability. I observed her closely, noting her consistency, her attentiveness, and her willingness to offer support without intrusion. In these lessons, I began to understand that fractured faith need not be permanent, that even amidst betrayal and disappointment, it was possible to reconstruct a sense of security, purpose, and direction. By the end of my 16th year, the weight of betrayal had not diminished, but my understanding of it had evolved. I recognized the necessity of discernment, the value of resilience, and the importance of seeking support beyond the confines of my fractured home. The journey ahead remained uncertain, the path forward difficult and fraught with emotional complexity, yet I had begun to chart it with deliberate intention. The fractures in my faith, though painful, had become the impetus for growth, self-reflection, and the cautious reconstruction of trust. And in that fragile space between despair and hope, I discovered a tentative truth. The world might fail me. Those who should protect me might betray me. Yet within myself, there existed a capacity for endurance, for reflection, and ultimately, for the reclamation of agency and spirit. This understanding would carry me forward into the next stages of my journey, where the consequences of betrayal would deepen, yet so too would the strength, courage, and clarity that would define the woman I was becoming. The days after my 16th year were filled with quiet struggle, a delicate balancing act between endurance and the faint hope that salvation might arrive. Though the betrayal I had endured at home had left its mark, the presence of Margaret Sinclair offered a thread of continuity, a subtle reminder that not all adults were complicit in the suppression of my voice. Yet even with her support, I was acutely aware that my safety, my voice, and my future were largely my own responsibility. Every day became a negotiation with fear, a careful navigation of the world I had been thrust into without choice. It was in this precarious state that the first tangible hand of rescue appeared. I remember the afternoon clearly. The sky outside was pale and overcast, winter pressing its chill into the streets, the year 1968 almost at its close. The convent hallways were quiet, the soft echo of our footsteps magnifying every thought and movement. Margaret had been occupied elsewhere, tending to duties among the younger girls, when a figure I did not recognize approached me. She was a woman of calm authority, her presence commanding but not harsh, a gentle firmness in her voice that drew attention without demanding it. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, a visiting member of the convent's supervisory council, tasked with ensuring the welfare of the girls under care. At first, I was hesitant, instinctively shrinking back, unsure whether this new presence could be trusted. My previous experiences had taught me caution, that gestures of concern often came intertwined with judgment or ulterior motive. Yet there was something in Sister Agnes's manner, her patience, her attention to detail, the way she observed without pressing, that suggested genuine care. She did not immediately question me about my life at home. She did not demand confessions or explanations. Instead, she offered small, steady gestures, a quiet smile, an attentive ear, the occasional word of encouragement during lessons. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly stabilizing. Over the next weeks, her visits became more frequent, each interaction carefully calibrated to provide support without overwhelming. She introduced me to exercises in reflection and journaling, encouraging me to write my thoughts and feelings without fear of reprisal. I had resisted such acts before, wary of the consequences if my mother discovered what I was recording. Now, under her careful guidance, I began to acknowledge the emotions I had long buried: the fear, the anger, the sorrow, and slowly, the beginnings of hope. It was in these private acts that I felt the first stirrings of agency, the knowledge that I could reclaim some portion of my life from the shadows that had long dominated it. Margaret Sinclair remained a steady companion throughout this period, observing quietly, providing encouragement without intrusion. The two of them, Margaret and Sister Agnes, created a network of support I had never known, one that allowed me to explore the fragile edges of trust without fear of immediate betrayal. I began to recognize the importance of external validation, of having witnesses who could see the truth of my experience and offer guidance rather than dismissal or complicity. For the first time, I felt that my voice, though cautious, mattered. The emotional shift was subtle at first, but grew steadily. I began to assert small boundaries, testing the limits of my autonomy. At home, I still navigated carefully, avoiding overt confrontation, yet I started to recognize my own strength in observation and decision-making. The daily routines of chores, lessons, and prayers became opportunities to practice measured assertion. A carefully chosen word, a deliberate action, a quiet refusal to yield completely. These acts, though small, represented the initial steps toward reclaiming a sense of control over my environment, and by extension, my own life. Sister Agnes's influence extended beyond the practical. She encouraged me to see my experiences as lessons rather than purely as sources of shame or fear. We discussed resilience, the quiet courage required to endure betrayal, and the power of hope even when circumstances appeared bleak. Through these conversations, I began to develop a conceptual framework for survival, one that combined vigilance with deliberate trust, reflection with cautious engagement. For the first time, I could envision a life beyond mere endurance, a life where my choices, however constrained, could shape the trajectory of my days. In parallel, Margaret Sinclair continued her subtle guidance, reinforcing the lessons Sister Agnes imparted. Her presence reminded me that consistency, observation, and compassion were vital components of support. Together, these two women offered a model of care I could both rely upon and emulate, demonstrating that integrity and kindness could coexist even amidst adversity. Their example became a blueprint for navigating relationships, discerning trust, and cultivating resilience in a world that had so often taught me fear and caution. By the close of that year, I had begun to take more deliberate actions towards self-preservation. I maintained careful records of events, articulated boundaries internally if not externally, and tested the reliability of those around me. Each small success, each moment of self-assertion reinforced my growing confidence. The hand that had reached out, first Sister Agnes, then reinforced by Margaret Sinclair, offered the support I needed to transform silent endurance into proactive resilience. I realized, in those quiet, reflective moments, that the journey towards safety, autonomy, and healing would be long and uncertain. Yet the first tangible gestures of intervention had set a precedent, a pattern that allowed me to envision a future in which betrayal would no longer dictate the terms of my existence. I began to understand that though the past could not be undone, the present could be navigated with care, and the future, however distant, could be claimed with intention, courage, and support. And in the silence of my room, at the edge of my narrow bed, I allowed myself a rare thought, that hope, when nurtured carefully, could take root even in the harshest soil, and that the hands of those willing to reach out could guide me toward a life that, though scarred, was mine to reclaim. By the time I reached my 17th year, the contours of my life were beginning to shift. The betrayals of the past, though heavy and painful, had become a foundation upon which I could begin to rebuild myself. I had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of my household, to assert boundaries, and to cultivate resilience. Yet beyond survival, I longed for more, a life where purpose and safety could coexist, where I could transform the pain I had endured into a path forward. The quiet guidance of Margaret Sinclair and the tangible support of Sister Agnes had laid the groundwork, and now I faced a choice: to remain trapped in the shadows of my past, or to step fully into a life of my own making. It was during the spring of 1969, the air fragrant with early blooms, that I first seriously contemplated the path of religious vocation. The convent had always been a refuge, a place where safety and learning intersected, and now it represented a potential avenue to reclaim my autonomy. I spent hours in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, not in despair but in contemplation, weighing the options before me. To devote myself to a life of service, discipline, and faith was to embrace structure, a community, and purpose, a stark contrast to the chaos of my home. Yet it also demanded sacrifice, vigilance, and unwavering commitment. I considered the implications carefully, recognizing that this choice would shape not only my immediate existence, but the trajectory of my adult life. Margaret Sinclair observed these contemplations with her characteristic subtlety. She never pressed, never insisted, allowing me to arrive at my own conclusions while offering quiet guidance. She provided literature, introduced me to rituals and practices, and shared her own reflections on the discipline and rewards of a life devoted to service. Through her example, I began to see that the path I chose could be both sanctuary and mission, a way to channel past suffering into meaningful action. Her presence reinforced the lesson I had learned from Sister Agnes. Trust must be measured, and support is most powerful when given without demand. The decision to commit fully to the convent was not made lightly. I consulted with mentors, senior sisters, and spiritual advisors, each interaction reinforcing the importance of deliberate choice. I recognized that the vows I would take, poverty, chastity, obedience, were not merely symbolic, but practical frameworks that would allow me to live with integrity, safety, and purpose. They represented boundaries that could protect me from the kinds of betrayals I had endured, and structures that could help me cultivate resilience and autonomy. The process of discernment, though emotionally taxing, solidified my resolve, and I felt for the first time that I could actively shape the life I had long been denied. In preparation for this new life, I undertook training as a novice with a seriousness that surprised even me. Each task, from the meticulous folding of habits to the precise tending of the convent gardens, was an exercise in discipline and focus. The routine provided stability, a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the unpredictability of my previous home. I learned to navigate relationships within the convent with care, observing patterns of interaction, discerning the intentions of those around me, and choosing where to extend trust. The skills honed during years of vigilance at home became invaluable tools, allowing me to move through the world with confidence, grace, and measured caution. Mentally and spiritually, I also worked to reclaim the parts of myself that had been suppressed by fear. I journaled extensively, recording reflections, prayers, and aspirations. I acknowledged the betrayals I had endured, yet I reframed them as lessons in resilience, observation, and self-reliance. I practiced meditation and prayer not merely as ritual, but as tools for grounding, self-reflection, and empowerment. Each day, I strengthened the inner fortitude that would support me through future challenges, and I began to feel a sense of autonomy that had been absent for too long. Teaching and mentorship became central to this new life. I was entrusted with guiding younger novices and students, a responsibility I approached with both care and rigor. In this role, I found a way to transform my past suffering into purposeful action, offering support, guidance, and protection to those who, like me, had once felt powerless. The satisfaction derived from these interactions reinforced the wisdom that had guided my choices, that even amidst betrayal and hardship, one can cultivate spaces of safety, growth, and compassion. The process of fully embracing convent life was accompanied by a deliberate effort to integrate past lessons into daily practice. I established boundaries, maintained vigilance, and extended measured trust to those who demonstrated reliability and integrity. I recognized the importance of balancing caution with engagement, independence with collaboration, and reflection with action. These principles, forged in the crucible of past suffering, became the framework upon which I could build a sustainable and fulfilling life. By the end of this transformative period, I had begun to see a future that was entirely my own. The fractures of the past remained, yet they no longer dictated the contours of my life. I understood that faith, resilience, and deliberate choice could coexist, creating a foundation upon which hope, autonomy, and purpose could flourish. Margaret Sinclair and Sister Agnes had shown me that support, when offered wisely, could empower rather than constrain, and I carried this understanding forward with intention, shaping a life of service and strength. In the quiet of the convent chapel one evening, as the sun set behind the stained glass, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayals, the silences, the fear, all had been catalysts for growth, resilience, and the deliberate choice to embrace a life of purpose. The act of choosing this new life, with full awareness of the past and the courage to shape the future, was itself an affirmation of agency, strength, and hope. I had stepped beyond the shadows of betrayal, and though the path ahead remained challenging, it was mine to walk with intention, dignity, and unwavering resolve. The years that followed my formal vows were not without challenge, yet they were imbued with a clarity and purpose that had once seemed impossible. I had arrived at a point where survival was no longer merely about enduring each day, but about shaping a life that reflected resilience, compassion, and intention. The betrayals I had experienced, the silences I had maintained, and the fear I had navigated all contributed to the woman I had become, someone capable of discernment, courage, and measured trust. Each morning, as I knelt in the chapel, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point, aware that the legacy of survival was not simply a personal triumph, but a roadmap for others who might face similar trials. Margaret Sinclair remained a quiet, enduring presence in my life, a model of steadfastness and integrity. Her influence, though subtle, had been instrumental in shaping my understanding of resilience and the value of careful guidance. She demonstrated, without ever demanding acknowledgement, that genuine care could exist without compromise, and that strength could be nurtured alongside compassion. I carried these lessons forward, using them to guide my actions and interactions with others within the convent, and later, with those in the broader community whom I was privileged to serve. Teaching became more than a duty. It was a vocation in its own right. I mentored younger novices and girls, instilling in them not only practical skills and religious knowledge, but also the principles of discernment, resilience, and measured trust that had allowed me to endure. I observed closely, offering guidance that was patient and intentional, mindful of the fragility of confidence and the importance of fostering both autonomy and community. The act of teaching was transformative, reinforcing my own growth while providing tangible support to those who might otherwise feel invisible or unsupported. I also cultivated spaces for reflection and healing. Quiet gardens, libraries, and study rooms became sanctuaries where students and novices could engage in contemplation, journaling, or prayer. I emphasized the importance of self-awareness, emotional regulation, and personal boundaries, imparting lessons born of experience rather than mere doctrine. Through these practices, I sought to ensure that the next generation would have access to the tools I had once lacked, providing a buffer against the vulnerabilities that had defined my early years. In parallel, I continued to maintain personal rituals that anchored me to the lessons of my past. Journaling, prayer, and meditation became acts of both reflection and reinforcement, allowing me to acknowledge past pain while remaining focused on present purpose. Each entry, each whispered prayer, was a testament to survival, a recognition that while the betrayals I endured had shaped me, they did not define the totality of my existence. I cultivated gratitude for the moments of support and the individuals who had extended their hands at critical junctures, understanding that such interventions were both rare and invaluable. The broader community also bore witness to the evolution of my role. I engaged in charitable activities, providing guidance and resources to those who had experienced marginalization, neglect, or abuse. The lessons learned in the crucible of my own life informed every decision, every interaction, every effort to create safety and stability for others. I recognized that the legacy of survival was not merely personal. It was relational, extending outward to influence and protect those who might be vulnerable. Reflection often brought me back to the early betrayals, the silences, and the moments of fear that had once consumed me. I revisited these memories not to dwell in sorrow, but to acknowledge their role in shaping resilience. The conscious act of remembrance allowed me to contextualize my experiences, integrating them into a narrative that emphasized growth, agency, and intentional living. I understood that survival required not only endurance, but also interpretation, the ability to extract meaning from pain and to translate it into wisdom and action. By my mid-20s, I recognized the profound shift that had occurred. The girl who had once moved through the world in fear, silenced by betrayal and uncertainty, had become a woman capable of shaping environments, guiding others, and embodying principles of trust and resilience. Each day, I engaged with life intentionally, recognizing the significance of each choice, each interaction, and each opportunity to provide care and guidance. The legacy of survival was no longer an abstract concept, but a lived reality, evidenced in the lives I touched and the structures I helped maintain. Even in moments of solitude, I reflected on the journey, acknowledging the critical roles played by those who had intervened at pivotal moments. Margaret Sinclair, Sister Agnes, and others whose presence had offered both support and a model of integrity. Their influence had demonstrated the possibility of guidance without coercion, care without compromise, and support without judgment. These lessons informed not only my interactions with others, but also the cultivation of my own moral and spiritual framework, reinforcing the understanding that resilience is both nurtured and exercised. As I entered my 30th year, I considered the totality of the path I had walked, the betrayals, the silences, the fear, and the painstaking work of self-preservation had not been in vain. Each challenge had reinforced principles of discernment, patience, and intentional action. The sanctuary I had cultivated within the convent, and the practices of reflection and mentorship I had established, were testaments to the possibility of life reclaimed from the shadows of past harm. The legacy of survival, once fragile and uncertain, had solidified into a tangible, living testament to endurance, courage, and hope. In the quiet of my room one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the hardships endured, but for the strength, clarity, and guidance that had allowed me to navigate them. I understood that the path had been neither simple nor linear, yet it had brought me to a place of agency, purpose, and compassion. The legacy of survival was mine to uphold, to pass forward, and to embody in every act of care, mentorship, and reflection. I was no longer defined solely by betrayal. I was defined by endurance, intentionality, and the reclamation of a life once threatened by silence and fear. And so, as I moved through the days, teaching, guiding, and reflecting, I carried within me the full weight of my experiences, transformed into wisdom and purpose. The past remained, but it no longer dictated my steps. It informed them. I had paid the price, yes, but I had also claimed a life of meaning, autonomy, and legacy. In that reclamation, I found not only survival, but the capacity to shape the future, for myself and for those whose paths I might illuminate along the way.